Using this triple prompt system, I was able to create 10 different content angles based on a text that I uploaded from a transcript of one of my YouTube videos. And these 10 content angles can be further used to repurpose and then edit into your own voice. By the way, stick with me to the end of the video so you can see exactly how I do this step by step. So the best way I can explain this system is it's going to condense your prompt library down to just 3 prompts that you could use for the information that you already have, whether it be like transcripts, clients calls, different materials that you have, notes, things like that. And it's going to be just the 3 prompts, and then that's what you could use as your workflow to repurpose everything and generate even more content ideas. So what it'll be is the first prompt is for the idea generation, and that's going to be the input and the output. And as you can see there, the rule is you have to use material that you're feeding in that you already have. That's like real world stuff. That's not something that's made up. So, like it says there, raw client questions, DMs, comments, unpolished. Like I said, you can put in notes, things like that. And then the output is going to be the angles, like I showed you in the intro of this video. And you could also, add a hook in and everything, and it'll just basically exponentially, generate even more ideas for you to use for your content. The second prompt is going to be for repurposing, and it'll just take one piece of content and then you can turn it into multiple ideas or multiple pieces of content. The third is going to be the most important one, which is the voice. So you're going to have to edit it so it will be in your own voice, so that way it'll sound like you and it won't sound like some kind of like generic output. And this is how they're going to chain together. So the first day you would go idea generation, pick 2 to 3 different angles. And then Tuesday you would take one of those angles and they would repurpose it into different formats. And then the rest of the week you would figure out the voice section. You would edit your voice. Before you posted anything, you would draft it, read it through, edit it out. And then once you're finally done and you're satisfied with it, then you would post it. So this is the criteria basically condensed down into one. It would be the 10 angles, distinct types, challenge and assumption, hooks in under 15 words. That's the idea portion of it. Then the repurposing, as you can see, and then you would edit it for the voice. So that's basically what you would run through as this type of workflow. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and show you the same thing on my screen. I'm going to share my screen with claudecowork, and I'll use mine first, my own niche, and then I will try a couple of other niches to show you the results. So real quick, as an FYI, the easiest way that I do this, stuff like this, and you could do it too, is just create a folder somewhere on your PC or your device, whatever you're using, and just point cowork to it. So what I did was, before I paste in the prompt, I'll show you. I have the transcript here. It's from one of my recent YouTube videos. I have the transcript in here as a text file in that folder already. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and paste in. This is the prompt here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and paste a skeleton generic version of this prompt in the video description so you could fill in your own information. So yours will be a different niche. I'm using my own niche, which is Claude Content Specialist is what I'm putting. And what I'm doing is I help coaches save time in their business by using Claude to repurpose their content, more or less. And as you can see here, it says generate 10 content angles from the transcript in the folder. What I like to do is I kind of give it like a little, little formatting, put the spaces in between a couple of different things so it groups everything together. So like right here it has the rules, and as you can see right here, it tells what to do for each angle. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and send this off, and I will be back to show you the results of the angles that it came up with. Alrighty, here's the result it came up with. So what it did was it gave 2 of the same of several different types of angles. So right here it says myth busting as number 1. Down here there's also a myth busting. So the idea behind this is then I could take each of these content angles and I could make multiple pieces of content, videos, LinkedIn posts, IG posts, X, TikTok, whatever it's going to be, and then put them up, and you could generate tons of different types of ideas this way. So a perfect example would be if I was going to create a piece of content on a personal story, the hook for that would be I typed one prompt and got 5 pieces of content back. And then the core point of that would be one prompt describing your niche and platform can generate a week's worth of YouTube and LinkedIn ideas in under a minute. So, just from that one alone, I could create, videos and other types of content for the different formats on different platforms. So, this is the first prompt. And as you can see, it generated these 10 content angles. And by the way, you could keep going with this. You could go in and you can just keep typing, please create 10 more content angles based on this, the past prompt. So that's going to be the first one. The next one I'm going to show you is about the repurposing. And then the third one is going to be about putting it into your own voice. So I'm going to go here and I'll be back in a second with the prompt for the repurposing. So what I'm going to do with this prompt, and another FYI, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll upload this prompt also as a skeleton prompt so you can fill in your own information. I'll do the same with all the others. So I'm going to paste it in. And by the way, I still have CloudCowork with this folder selected. So I'll paste in this prompt. And what I'm going to do with this one is slightly different. You can do it a couple of different ways. So I have this as take this one piece of content and turn it into 4 platform-specific formats using the chosen angle. So the source content is going to be what I have in that folder. It's the same transcript I have in the folder. So I pointed it to it. I said source content. I said use the transcript in the folder. And then I put in the name here of the actual file, which I named after the video. This would be the chosen angle. And it's the angle about the personal story with the hook. And the actual prompt is going to have it generate short form video script, Instagram carousel, YouTube short, and newsletter or email version. So again, what I like to do is I like to format it a little bit in the prompt so I can separate and see what it actually says before I send it off. And at the end, it's got the rules. All 4 formats come from this one piece of source content. Do not add new claims. Match the pacing to the platform, so like short form equals fast and punchy, email equals slower and more personal. And also it's going to say don't repeat the same opening line across all the formats. So I'll go ahead and I'll send this off, and I will be back shortly to show you all of the stuff that it came up with. So here is the result that it came up with. It came up with the 4 different things in the prompt that I wanted. So a short form video script, an Instagram carousel. This is actually not the actual carousel, obviously, with the slides and everything, but this would be you could use this as the context or the prompt for the Instagram carousel or the LinkedIn carousel if you wanted. You would basically just prompt it to create this, and you would tell it to use this right here as the source to create the actual carousel. It also created a YouTube short. So this is the script for the YouTube short, a call to action it even gave you. And then this is the newsletter / email that it came up with, even came up with the subject line. Here's the body. So the notes right here at the bottom, these are also useful. You can read through them to see like no new claims added beyond what's in the transcript. So it basically tells you what it did. And next what I'll do is I'll show you the voice prompt, because you would take any of this content here and then you would have to run it through your like a voice prompt so it would sound like you and it would not sound generic. So I will be back in a second here to show you how to do that. So before I post this one, or sorry, before I paste this one in, I'll show you the folder. So what I did was I took that one that I showed you earlier. This is the script, the little short form script that I took from Claude after it generated it from the content angles that I took. And what I did was I put that into the prompt here, and I'll show you the prompt right now. So what it says is I'm going to give you real examples of how I actually write and talk, then a draft that needs to sound more like me. And the draft is actually the little text file that I just showed you that I also put in this folder right here to make it easier. So I could use it as reference. So for my real voice, I put use the transcript in the folder. This is the original transcript from the YouTube video that I took the transcript from. And also what I did was I put a voice description. So what it says is it used the transcript in the folder, and it says use the voice description for reference as my real voice. So the voice description is casual, direct, to the point, instructional. And for the draft that needs editing, this is the name of that text that I just showed you, the little text file. So it says right here, short form draft dot text. And the instructions are to rewrite the draft to match my real voice above. And then it'll say specifically, I don't know why I keep doing that every time I hit enter. Specifically match my sentence length and rhythm, short and punchy versus long and flowing. Look at my samples. So it basically gives all the rules. Even at the bottom here, it says, do not improve my grammar if it changes. And it also says, read it aloud in your head before finalizing. If it sounds like a script, redo it. So I'll go ahead and I will send that off. And I will be back to show you what the result is that it came up with. So I'll go ahead and show you what it came up with here. And it's very similar to what it already was, but it's not exactly the same because it's based on my description and also the information that I put into the prompt. So like in a second here, I'll show you, I'll bring it up on the screen, the original one. So it's very similar. The other one said basically the same thing here, but the difference with this one is, and I'll bring it up on the screen here, it says, I help solopreneurs with time management. Give me some YouTube and LinkedIn ideas. And this one says, someone who helps solopreneurs with time management, give me YouTube and LinkedIn ideas. So it changed some of the words. And right here, down here, it'll tell you. So it took out no joke, messing around, by the way, and basically. So that's the basic changes that it made. And I'll go down here and I'll show you. So what it says here is, and by the way, you're not stuck with what it gives you. And on the original one, it just says, and you're stuck with what it gives you. So it tells you right here, it says same message. It just sounds like you instead of wrote it. It says it sounds like you said it instead of wrote it. So it's basically taking words out and making it sound more punchy, which is what I put in there into the prompt, as you saw when I put into the voice description section. By the way, one thing I wanted to mention, I'll show you this again. If you don't like any of this, this is why you should edit it further to make it sound like yourself, as well as if you have a skill created for like your brand voice, that option is another option. So you could also use that, and then you could compare the two. So the way you would do it is you would click brand voice or whatever the name of the skill is, you would invoke it, and then you would give it a prompt to say, please rewrite this in my brand voice. And then what you would do is you would look at that and compare it to this one here, and you would compare both to see which one actually sounds more like you. So that's just one thing I wanted to note for anyone that wants to learn how to do that. If you want to learn how to create a skill like this, somewhere up above, a card should pop out. One of my previous videos I actually showed how to do this. So just thought I would mention that as an FYI. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully this gave you some idea of how you can repurpose your content and you can generate all the different content angles based on some of the transcripts or the back catalog of information that you may already have. Also other content that you may already have, so it's easy to do this. Anyone can do it, and it will generate almost an infinite number of content ideas if you do this correctly. So that's going to wrap it up for this one. Don't forget to check the links in the video description. And with that, thank you for watching.